We're starting this podcast at a fountain in Kansas City, one I'm sure you've seen on TV. It's an iconic memorial to a visionary man who changed the way Americans live, work, and shop. But people here are starting to realize there was an ugly side to this vision. So ugly that some want his name stricken from this beautiful fountain. We'll also look at a new film that takes a deep dive into those perennial urban dwellers, rats. Ew. And by the way, that has something to do with this fountain, too. We begin at the entrance to a shopping center. Not just any shopping center. This is the Country Club Plaza in Kansas City, Missouri, America's oldest planned retail space, dating back to 1922. With its striking Spanish-themed buildings and thousands of parking spaces, the plaza was a car-friendly shopping center before most Americans even had cars. It was the brainchild of a man named J.C. Nichols, one of the most visionary designers of cityscapes in the first half of the 20th century. He built thousands of homes right here in Kansas City, arranging them in planned communities that were stylish and affordable. 7 decades after his death, J.C. Nichols is regarded as one of the godfathers of modern urban design. But people here are now challenging that legacy. J.C. Nichols was also one of the godfathers of white flight. They say not only did he fail to challenge existing norms of segregation, he codified them. He empowered realtors to divide our cities and suburbs along racial lines.
You know, this man changed the course of this city for generations in terms of black-white relations. Take his name off the fountain.
My name's Aaron Barnhart, and this is Monumental, a podcast that slows down and takes a closer look at our country's drive-by history. And once again, I'm joined by Eric Stafford, proprietor of Kansas City Tour Company, who's going to help me make sense of all this. Thanks for being on the podcast again.
Well, thank you. Always a pleasure.
So let's describe the scene around us here. This is not just a standalone, sterile shopping mall like the big empty malls you see decaying all across America, is it?
No, it's not. It's actually the first retail shopping district accessible by automobile in the nation. It was established in 1922. It was part of the Country Club district, which was developed by J.C. Nichols.
First of all, if every shopping center was built as beautifully as the Country Club Plaza, we wouldn't be complaining about shopping center, strip mall, urban blight.
Right.
But this particular way of designing, let's say it, a community.
It's a master plan community with, you have retail surrounded by residential property.
That's right. And then lots and lots of office spaces.
Yes.
So you could literally live here and walk to work. These days when you see a new 3 or 4 story building going up and it combines retail and residential and working space, it has sidewalks, it's very people-centered. That's J.C. Nichols. He designed all of this into the Country Club Plaza and his subdivisions really at the dawn of the modern real estate era. And in fact, the Urban Land Institute, which is based in Washington, D.C., gives out an award called the J.C. Nichols Prize for Visionaries in Urban Development. And the Institute believed so much in his vision of cities that they helped produce a documentary that aired across the country on public television to show how the legacy of Nichols lives on into the 21st century.
Nichols' vision of community made him a local legend. Today, that vision is slowly being revived and may help change the face of America.
So that's one side of the J.C. Nichols legacy, his genius for designing commercial spaces that bring people together. And it's epitomized by this majestic fountain that was purchased and located here after his death by the family of J.C. Nichols, which continues to pay for its upkeep.
And it is said, or it's debatable, that the only city in the world with more fountains than Kansas City is Rome. And so we have fountains all throughout.
Yeah, we got like 200 of them. But if you're watching a football game or something, this is the one
you're going to see this one.
But here in Kansas City, the other legacy of J.C. Nichols is in residential neighborhoods, and that's where the controversy lies. So, Eric, every J.C. Nichols homeowner was bound by something called a restrictive covenant. What did that involve?
Well, restrictive covenants were contained within the deeds that had specifics in regards to the ownership of this property. They also contained, if you purchase this property, it's conditional. You cannot sell or rent to a Negro or Jew, whatever restrictions they felt the need to put in place. That I can't say that he is the inventor of segregation or restrictive covenants. I cannot say that, but did he perpetuate it? Yes, indeed he did. And it was but this was in the 1920s, during the era of Jim Crow segregation, and it's believed that the presence of blacks would automatically devalue property. It was automatically assumed. That was just within the underwriting guidelines. It's just the way it was.
Well, I think you're getting at the heart of the defense that many people who like J.C. Nichols and want to preserve his legacy will come up with when they're asked about the restrictive covenants, because it's absolutely undeniable. These things were baked in, and in fact, Nichols did a legal maneuver to make sure that they didn't expire after 10 years, but they were in for perpetuity. And when they're confronted with this, you do hear, in fact, people say, basically, he was a product of his time. So people in the 1920s did not know that excluding African Americans from neighborhoods was wrong?
Yes, they did know it was wrong. They did. Because African Americans spoke up, for one. People here in Kansas City like Nelson Cruz.
Nelson Cruz was?
He was the editor of the Kansas City Sun newspaper.
And that was a
weekly newspaper that was established around 1906, and it lasted up until 1924. So it's a predecessor of the Call paper, which started in 1919.
So these were both newspapers aimed at an African-American readership.
Yeah.
These newspapers, then, part of their editorial mission was to call out in a public space, that is to say the pages of their newspaper, the denial of the American dream to their readers.
Right.
I assume there's an NAACP in Kansas City at this time?
Yes, there was an NAACP here in Kansas City.
So no shortage of voices, if they would be listened to,
right,
to call out the problems and the inherent white supremacist view of housing segregation.
And it was that way up until the 1948.
Okay, so now I want to connect some dots, because these aren't just the bygone days of segregation. We're still living with the legacy of these restrictive covenants. To understand that better, we're going to turn to a new film about rats. When I say Baltimore, what images or thoughts come to mind? I was a baseball-crazy kid growing up in Billings, Montana. Back then, Baltimore meant Brooks Robinson, Jim Palmer, Mike Cuellar, and other greats on those Orioles championship teams, including our hometown star, Dave McNally. Later, as television critic of the Kansas City Star, I knew Baltimore as the setting for one of the grittiest and, I would contend, the best series ever produced for American TV, The Wire. But if you listen to right-wing radio or TV, Baltimore is the poster child for everything that's gone wrong with the liberal welfare state.
More protesters getting ready to hit the streets in Baltimore, and some Democrats now blaming the media and the police for inner-city problems. But should they be pointing the finger at 40 years of liberal policies instead?
It's inculcated dependency. It's retarded the growth in a lot of these communities. And most importantly, it's destroyed these people's self-esteem over now many, many generations. So,
well, if the people of Baltimore want to know why their city is the way that it is, all they have to do is look at the Democratic Party. These are the people who have been calling the shots for decades.
In fact, not long ago, I was back in Billings and talking politics with a friend of mine, a former Republican state legislator, when out of nowhere he said, "What about Baltimore?" Indeed, what about Baltimore?
It ain't never been a rat problem in Baltimore. Always been a people problem. And that ain't going to change until you educate the people.
The trailer for the documentary, Rat Film, leads you to believe it's an examination of one city's effort, and yes, the city is Baltimore, to rid itself of its enormous rodent population, led by the highly adaptive Norway rat.
The adult Norway rat can jump 32 inches high. Baltimore City trash cans are 34 inches high.
It's a funny, okay, weird movie. Like in the opening scene, we're at a drag strip where cars and trucks are ferociously burning rubber as spectators look on. And the drag strip's a motif throughout Rat Film, which I've seen 3 times now. I still don't have a clue why it's in there. Also throughout the film, Baltimore is turned into this giant video game using Google Street Maps.
A 3D terrain is created. The user assumes the role of a floating point within the game.
Look, I'm not recommending this film for its documentary technique. I'm urging you to watch it for the history.
1911. Baltimore City enacts a resolution, an ordinance for preserving peace, preventing conflict, and ill feeling between the white and colored races. The law prohibits blacks from moving into majority white neighborhoods, and whites from moving into majority black neighborhoods.
The courts would strike down Baltimore City's attempt to legalize segregation, so after World War I, the realtors took over. These racial divides between neighborhoods would still be in force in the 1930s, when, at the depths of the Depression, the government got into the home mortgage loan business.
May 1st, 1937. Establishment of a map. Neighborhoods are arranged into 4 graded areas, green. In nearly all instances, they are the new well-planned sections of the city. Blue, quote, they're like a 1935 automobile, still good, but not what the people are buying today who can afford a new one. Red, quote, detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable population or an infiltration of it. These primarily black and mixed neighborhoods gained a new, ominous nickname. Redlined.
The author Richard Rothstein recently examined these government policies in his book, The Color of Law. What Rat Film asserts, Rothstein proves in a review of the historical record. Not just in Baltimore, but in city after city after city. Redlining takes non-white neighborhoods and cuts off their oxygen supply. By denying them valuable funding, redlining makes these city blocks even more decrepit, virtually solution-proof. By the time the liberal do-gooders came in with their welfare programs, a mere 50 years ago, the destruction was nearly complete. And by the time the director of this film, Theo Anthony, overlays maps of present-day Baltimore on the 1937 Red Line map, you understand. Rats thrive where neighborhoods don't. The bank robber Willie Sutton once said he went where the money is. Rats go where the money isn't. The money that's controlled by the private, not the public sector. On his frequent visits to Washington, D.C., J.C. Nichols would have encountered these leading real estate men who redlined Baltimore City. Did they influence him? Did he influence them? Does it really matter? Here, to me, is the most devastating part of this legacy. Nichols' impact on black wealth extends into the 21st century and today. According to Richard Rothstein, in his book, he says African American wealth today is about 5% of white wealth. That is to say, the average white household has 20 times more wealth, net worth, than
black
households.
That's an astounding statistic. It's mind-blowing. And here we are in 2008. This is 2018, a 2018 fact.
Yep. Well, most middle-class families in this country get their wealth not from their paychecks, but from the equity they have in their homes, which they can then pass on to their children. I couldn't afford the car that I drove here today by myself, but after my father died, we sold his house. And I used the proceeds to replace our 17-year-old Honda with that car. That is a wealth transfer.
Really what you're saying, that it's old money, it's inherited, it's been passed down, but all that is due to values in property.
So now we're going to get in my car and go to a very different part of town, and you're going to show me some of the Kansas City that J.C. Nichols wanted nothing to do with.
Correct.
We'll continue our journey into the legacy of redlining in our next episode, when we visit a storied African-American community and get at this question: does J.C. Nichols deserve to have his name attached to Kansas City's most beloved fountain? That's on the next episode of Monumental.